Welcome to the Cyber Philosophy channel. Facing today's conflict between Israel, the US, and Iran, what solutions can the world offer? This episode attempts to explain using the wisdom contained in a mad life.
Yeah, and today we are taking on a really unique mission with this deep dive.
We really are. We've got this stack of incredibly intense, real-time news reports.
Right, detailing the massive 2026 military conflict
Yeah.
that is basically exploding right now between the U.S., Israel, and Iran.
Exactly. And we are fusing those reports with, well, something completely unexpected.
Right.
We're pairing these urgent geopolitical updates with a fascinating academic paper titled Seeing the Hope of Life in Madness.
Which sounds wild, I know. But our goal for this deep dive is to see if we can apply ancient philosophy and modern sociology to decode and, potentially find a solution for a terrifying modern war.
But before we get into it, we need to cover some ground rules.
Yes, definitely. It is crucial to state something clearly to you, the listener. The news sources we are examining today contain highly politically charged content regarding the United States, Israel, and Iran.
Supercharged.
Right. We must be absolutely clear that we are not taking any sides, nor are we endorsing any geopolitical viewpoints, military actions, or political strategies.
We're just looking at the facts.
Exactly. Our role here is solely to impartially report on the events exactly as they are described in the provided source material, allowing us to explore the philosophical and sociological ideas contained within them.
Okay, let's unpack this. So, late February and early March 2026.
The geopolitical landscape just completely fractured.
Yeah, according to our sources, the United States and Israel launched unprecedented, massive airstrikes against Iran.
Two major coordinated campaigns.
Right. Operation Rising Lion by Israel and Operation Epic Fury by the United States. Just a colossal projection of military power.
And the sheer scale of these operations, it fundamentally altered the balance of power in a matter of hours.
It's terrifying.
It is. The sources detail that Israel deployed over 200 fighter jets in a multi-wave assault. Their targets were the absolute core of Iran's military and nuclear infrastructure.
Right.
They struck the nuclear facilities at Natanz, the installations at Isfahan, and explicitly targeted the highly fortified uranium enrichment base at Fordo.
The one that's buried like 50 meters into a mountain.
Exactly. Deep underground.
Yeah.
Furthermore, they decimated missile and drone production factories across the entire country.
Yeah.
But the most geopolitically destabilizing aspect of these strikes was the targeted decapitation of the leadership.
Yeah, the casualty list from the upper echelons is just staggering. The strikes eliminated top Iranian military commanders. We're talking Major General Mohammad Bagheri, the Chief of Staff, Major General Ghulam Ali Rashid,
And the commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Hossein Salami.
Right. And perhaps most consequentially, our sources confirm the assassination of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei.
Taking out an entire command structure alongside the spiritual and political head of state in a single night, it creates an immediate, volatile power vacuum.
And the fallout from that vacuum is exactly why this matters to you, the listener, regardless of where you live.
Because it affects everything.
It really does. Iran hasn't surrendered in the face of this overwhelming force. Instead, they've launched an asymmetric war of attrition. They immediately targeted the Strait of Hormuz.
Which handles 20% of global oil.
Exactly. And because of that threat, global oil prices instantly spiked past $112 a barrel.
Wow.
And the financial markets just went into free fall. The sources highlight the panic in Asia, noting a catastrophic 2,000-point drop in Taiwanese stocks.
With tech giants like TSMC taking a massive plunge.
Yeah.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see a clash of fundamentally incompatible strategic objectives. On one side, the United States, under President Trump, is utilizing this overwhelming military force to push for definitive regime change in Tehran.
Right. The operational assumption is that by decapitating the leadership and destroying the infrastructure, the government will inevitably collapse.
Exactly. On the other side, Iran understands it cannot win a symmetrical conventional war against the combined might of the U.S. and Israel. Their strategy is to weaponize time and geography.
Drag it out as long as possible.
Right. By threatening global shipping and energy supplies, they aim to drag this out, inflicting maximum political and economic pain on the U.S., Israel, and the global economy. They're calculating that the cost of the war will eventually become too high for their adversaries to sustain.
So we have a situation where conventional deterrence has utterly failed, and all players are locked in a devastating spiral that is dragging the rest of the globe down with them.
It feels entirely irrational.
It does. But that grim reality is precisely why we are pivoting to our academic source. Because if the world is acting mad and conventional logic has failed, maybe we need mad thinkers to help us understand it.
I love this pivot.
Right. This brings us to the two central figures of our academic paper. Zhuangzi, the ancient Chinese philosopher from the chaotic Warring States period, and Nicholas Luhmann, a highly influential 20th century German sociologist.
It is a remarkable academic pairing. Both men lived through eras of immense global upheaval and warfare, and both produced theories so radically divergent from the mainstream that their contemporaries literally considered them mad.
Yeah, the paper actually highlights their madness. There is this famous story about Zhuangzi where his wife died, and instead of weeping when mourners arrived, he was sitting on the floor banging on a tub and singing.
People thought he was entirely out of his mind.
Totally. And then Nicholas Luhmann, writing in the aftermath of World War II when the world was desperate to rebuild humanism, shocked the academic establishment by flatly claiming humans are not part of society.
Which is quite the statement.
Right. How does a sociologist even arrive at the conclusion that humans aren't part of society?
It stems from his core concept, which happens to be the exact same concept that unites him with Zhuangzi, decentralization, or in Chinese, 扩宗新化.
Okay.
Both thinkers aggressively dismantle the idea that the human ego, or the individual perspective, is the center of the universe. For Luhmann and his social systems theory, society is not a collection of biological human beings. It is an incredibly complex, autonomous network of communications.
So people are just...
Humans, with our biology and our individual psychological minds, merely provide the environment that allows these societal communications to happen. We irritate the system, we feed it, but we are not the masters of it.
The paper also mentions a concept from Zhuangzi called Zhuowang. How does his ancient philosophy tackle this same idea of decentralization?
Zhuowang translates to sitting in forgetfulness. It is the intentional practice of stripping away your ego, your prejudices, and your human-centric views of how the universe should operate.
Leaving all that baggage behind.
Exactly. You systematically forget your social status, your deep-seated political opinions, and your cultural conditioning until you are merely flowing with the natural order of things, rather than trying to force the universe to conform to your specific desires.
Here's where it gets really interesting. How does the philosophy of an ancient sage banging on a tub and a sociologist who thinks humans are just biological environments actually help us decode the exploding missiles and crashing stock markets in the Middle East right now?
We can apply their theories by examining what the academic paper calls the mind of right and wrong, Shifei Jixin. The paper posits that this concept is the absolute root of the current war.
Right, because everybody thinks they're absolutely right.
Exactly. Let's look at the conflict strictly through this analytical lens. According to the news sources, Israel believes with absolute, unwavering certainty that it is right. They view Iran's nuclear program as an existential threat, a looming nuclear holocaust.
So from that perspective, a preemptive strike is not just strategically justified, it is a moral imperative.
Precisely.
But doesn't every nation going to war believe they are right? The United States views the Iranian regime as a sponsor of terror, making regime change the right outcome for global security.
Right.
Meanwhile, Iran views itself as a sovereign nation subjected to decades of crippling economic sanctions, suffering the assassination of its top leaders. Defending their soil and avenging their dead is, to them, their absolute right.
Yes.
If everyone is 100% convinced they are the heroes of the story, what makes Luhmann's take on this any different from standard geopolitical analysis?
What elevates Luhmann's analysis is his concept of second-order observation, Guansha. Luhmann argued that every system, whether it's a political apparatus, a military intelligence network, or a legal framework, observes the world strictly through its own binary code.
Give me an example of how that works.
A military system categorizes everything as threat or non-threat. A legal system sees legal or illegal. Because the system can only process information through its own specific code, it develops massive structural blind spots.
How does that blind spot function in this specific 2026 scenario?
Let's look at the intelligence apparatus. If an intelligence system is coded strictly to identify and neutralize military threats, it cannot simultaneously process the existential terror and historical trauma driving the adversary's actions. It only sees a target.
That makes a lot of sense.
Therefore, Luhmann concludes there is no single objective, absolute truth in these massive social conflicts. There are only system-specific communications clashing blindly against each other. First-order observation is simply seeing the enemy. Second-order observation is analyzing how the enemy system observes you.
The paper references Zhuangzi's chapter, the Qi Wu Lun, or On the Equality of Things, in relation to this exact blind spot. How does an ancient Taoist approach a systemic communication failure?
Swansea pointed out thousands of years ago that endless conflicts happen because we become hopelessly trapped in what he calls the small achievements. Xiaocheng. The small achievements of our own logic. We build these intricate, flawless, internally consistent arguments for why our side is right and the other side is unequivocally wrong. What we fail to realize is that the opposing side is utilizing the exact same cognitive machinery to build an equally flawless internal justification.
I want you to think about that dynamic for a moment. Think about how often you get trapped in your own absolute rightness in your daily life.
It happens all the time.
Have you ever been in a heated argument where you were so utterly convinced of your own logic that you completely stopped hearing the other person? You dig your heels in deeper, constructing a perfect case in your mind, escalating a personal conflict just like these nations do on a global scale?
Yes.
We all suffer from this mind of right and wrong, and it consistently blinds us to the actual mechanics of the dispute.
That is a perfect micro-level comparison. However, in the geopolitical arena, the stakes of this systemic blindness are exponentially higher, leading us directly to the ultimate dread driving this entire crisis.
Yeah.
The academic text identifies this as the mind of life and death. Sheng Jixin.
The raw existential terror operating beneath the political rhetoric.
Yeah,
The fear of complete annihilation. Israel's entire defense posture is driven by the fear of a nuclear strike, the literal death of their nation. Iran is fighting against the forceful death of its political regime and the collapse of its sovereignty.
and looking at the massive economic fallout, the rest of the world is gripped by the fear of profound economic death. Every player on the board is acting out of a desperate primal survival instinct.
So how does the madness of our two thinkers offer any kind of practical solution to this level of existential terror?
The paper outlines a profound philosophical shift regarding how we perceive time and survival. Luhmann, in his systems theory, argues that systems paralyze themselves by viewing the past and the future as absolute beginnings and definitive ends. Instead, he proposes viewing them merely as horizons of meaning.
Horizons of meaning. Walk me through how that applies to the decision makers in this conflict.
When a nation looks at the future, if its horizon is entirely filled with a hypothetical catastrophe, like a nuclear exchange, or when it looks at the past and its horizon is filled with historical grievances, it becomes trapped.
Because they can't see anything else.
Right. The system spends all its energy reacting to those horizons rather than processing the reality of the present moment. Obsessing over absolute survival or absolute destruction prevents any functional communication in the now.
And Zhuangzi pushes that concept even further into the realm of nature. For him, life and death are not opposites to be feared and fought against at all costs. They're simply different phases of a single, continuous, natural flow.
Yes. The academic paper argues that the ultimate solution lies in the deep realization that all things are interconnected. Wanwu Xixing Guan.
But how does realizing we are all connected practically stop a massive bombing campaign?
This is exactly where the concept of decentralization transitions from an abstract philosophy into a concrete strategy for peace. If the nations involved in this 2026 war adopted this decentralized view, abandoning their rigid, egocentric systemic codes, they would realize a terrifying truth.
Which is?
Their own survival is intrinsically linked to the survival of their enemies. In a hyper-globalized world, you cannot neatly, surgically remove an adversary from the global system without inflicting catastrophic damage upon the entire system, including yourself.
The economic data from our sources proves that point perfectly. The U.S. and Israel might possess the military capability to physically devastate Iran's infrastructure, but the moment Iran responds by threatening the Strait of Hormuz, shutting down 20% of the global oil supply, the economic blowback is instantaneous.
It affects everyone.
Taiwan's stock market crashing and the plunge in semiconductor giants like TSMC show that an attack on one node sends devastating shockwaves through the entire network. The shared lifeblood of the global economy makes absolute victory an illusion.
This raises an important question. Does the very nature of modern asymmetric warfare, with its immediate, uncontainable economic ripple effects, fundamentally prove Zhuangzi's ancient point?
That is a great point.
It forcefully demonstrates that attempting to entirely dominate the world, to force the global environment to conform exclusively to your system's code, ultimately destroys the conqueror alongside the conquered.
It's a heavy realization. We started this deep dive with the terrifying concrete facts of a massive war: fighter jets, deep underground bunker busters, assassinated leaders, and plunging stock markets.
Right.
And we used the madness of an ancient Taoist and a modern German sociologist to uncover that the most dangerous enemies aren't just the opposing armies. The real threats are our own rigid mind of right and wrong and our paralyzing mind of life and death.
Indeed. The synthesis of these sources suggests that actual sustainable peace requires vastly more than just a negotiated ceasefire. It requires a radical decentralization of our own systemic egos and a profound recognition of our shared, inescapable interconnectedness.
As we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. Building on Nicholas Luhmann's theories from our sources, he famously suggested that sincerity cannot be communicated. A social system can only be irritated by its environment. It can never be directly, mechanically controlled by external forces.
Because it's a closed system.
Right. If that sociological principle holds true, if you can never truly force another complex system to internally adopt your specific truth or binary code, then is the entire premise of bombing a nation to force it to change its mind fundamentally flawed?
It's a question we have to ask.
Can military strikes ever actually change a system's internal code? Or do they merely ensure that the system will endlessly rebuild itself solely for the purpose of resisting you? Thank you for listening. We hope this episode has been helpful and inspiring to you. See you next time.